Hello, today we're talking about font families, talk a little bit about fonts and their development. All right, the first and the oldest font family we deal with is this old style font. And as you can see, if we take a close look, not all the stroke is the same weight. You have a thin part of the stroke, you have a thick part of the stroke, and also where the stroke ends, you have these little, some people would call them feet. The technical term is serif, and there is a serif whenever the stroke would begin or end. Now, this is supposed to mimic a quill writing letters. So if you took some poor unsuspecting bird and you plucked out its tail feather and you chopped off the end, you would not cut it to a point the way we have a pencil. You would cut it to an edge, and you would fill it the hollow feather tube with ink, and as the ink fell out, you would write. But because it was cut to an edge and not a point, depending on the way you're holding the quill, you would sometimes get a thin stroke, sometimes get a thick stroke, and on the curve, you actually see both. You see the thin-thick transition. These are all indicative of old-style fonts. By the way, old-style fonts are very easy to read. So this is the preferred font family of just about every novel you will find. Very common, very easy to read. Times is an example of an old-style font that you will find. Fast forward hundreds of years to the 1920s. In the peak of the Industrial Revolution, they wanted a font that showed how new and modern they were. So they came up with this font, Modern. You'll notice it still has all the same elements, a thin and a thick stroke, still has the serifs at the feet. But now notice this does not look like it was created with a quill. This was clearly more modern than that. Sadly, this font did not do well because from a distance, the thin part of the font would disappear entirely. So it turned out to be a poor font for signage. Turns out it's a little bit harder to read. So you do not see modern fonts very often. Occasionally you'll see some. Bodoni is an example of a modern font that may be on your computer, but you will not have a lot of these. Slab serif. It advanced to the 1960s. Fonts still have thin and thick transition. Fonts still have serifs, but you'll notice that we've made everything much more thick. This is great for posters, which were very common in the 1960s. If you were growing up in the 60s, you may have had posters of the Beatles and the Beach Boys in your room, and you needed a great font to capture the spirit of the 60s, and that would have been a slab serif font. Again, not the most readable, not good for a book, but it might work pretty good for a sign or a headline. Now we move on to the 1970s, and this is actually a very rebellious font. We're in America, we're in a war that's very unpopular. You have a strong generation gap. And to show our rebellion, we're going to do our letters differently. We're no longer going to have the thin, thick transition. We're no longer going to have the serifs. That's not the way people write now with ballpoint pens and pencils. So they created a font face to mirror that. And that is sans serif. Sans means without. So this sans serif literally means without the little feet at the end. Now, what they intended to be a very rebellious font ended up being a very legible font. This is a font that can be read quickly. As a matter of fact, it can be comprehended so rapidly that most street signs today are done with a sans serif type font. So if you're going down the freeway at 70 miles an hour and you only have a split second to read the sign, it will be in this type of a font. It's also good for headlines. It complements well the old style font. All right, now we're going to get into some specialty families. Formal occasions will often be marked with a script font. A script font tends to look like it was written by hand, often with a fancy pen. Some of them are quite fancy. If you get a wedding invitation or maybe a graduation announcement or invited to a bar mitzvah, you could expect to see something like a script font to let you know it's a formal occasion. All right, let's fast forward to the 1990s when the advent of the computer made it very easy for lots and lots of people to have very gorgeous typesetting. Suddenly became fashionable to have something that looked a little more distressed, ugly on purpose. And out of starting perhaps in Seattle, Washington, you had the grunge movement with punk rock, and that also found its way into typography with fringe fonts. So anything that looks like it's ugly or distressed on purpose would fit into this category. And there was a large variety of fringe fonts in the 90s and early 2000s. They're not quite as common today, but you might have a couple on your computer. Finally, a family worth mentioning is the decorative fonts. The decorative fonts. Now, these are almost as much art as they are text. Now, they still will be the shapes of some letters. It'll still be easy to still be readable, but you won't want to read a book in these. But it might be cute for a headline or a sign outside your business. And this is actually quite tame for decorative font. If you have birds that hold their wings in the shape that make letters, or you have tools that are, again, in the shape of letters, those might all classify as decorative fonts. So these are the various font families and how they appear.